If there are leaves of 3, then just leave it be. That's the motto for one of the most notorious plants on the West Coast, Pacific poison oak. Just that name alone can send shivers down the spines of those familiar with this infamous shrub. My name is Josh, and I'm an educator with Lindsay Wildlife Experience. For a few years now, I have had a deep fascination with poison oak. Although it receives a lot of disdain from the community, I have grown to truly admire it. After catching poison oak many times in recent years, I discovered that I was especially sensitive to the plant, getting rashes that lasted months. Now, after a dreadful experience with this horrific rash, some people might never want to set foot on a trail ever again. But instead, I developed a new interest for the plant. I started asking myself questions like, how does poison oak do this to us? And what is its purpose for existing? To uncover all of its mysteries, we must go on a quest to examine Pacific poison oak. Head to the nation's east, and you'll find the home of poison sumac. In just about every other place in the continental US, you'll find some type of poison ivy. But here, on the Pacific coast, we have Pacific poison oak, scientific name Toxicodendron diversilobum. Poison oak is a fascinating plant, but the US West is chock full of fascinating plants. It's one of the most biodiverse regions on the entire planet, home to thousands of different species. It's an area that houses plants with heights that rival that of the Statue of Liberty. Plants that are capable of resisting burning wildfires, and plants that are alive today that coexisted with ancient Egypt in the construction of the Great Pyramids thousands of years ago. Yet in this miraculous wonderland of flora, there is nothing else quite like poison oak. Make contact with this itch-causing shrub, and you may end up with a rash that is the epitome of irritation. So it raises the question, what about poison oak induces such intense reactions within our bodies? If we look more closely at the leaves of poison oak, the answer to our question becomes more clear. The texture of the leaves is shiny and oily. This shininess is an oil called urushiol oil that covers the leaves and the branches of poison oak. This is what causes skin reactions after we come into contact with poison oak. Urushiol is an oil with allergenic characteristics found in plants of the family Anacardiaceae. This family contains many notable plants such as poison oak, poison ivy, sumac, cashew, pistachio, and even mango trees. Have you ever noticed how cashews are almost always sold without their shells? Well, that's because the outer shell of the cashew is covered with urushiol oil, just like poison oak. The majority of people are allergic to urushiol oil, developing skin reactions after contact. This is known as urushiol-induced contact dermatitis, and it's never pleasant. However, according to the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources, about 15 to 20% of the population is not allergic to urushiol at all. If you have never gotten poison oak before, you may be one of those people. But is anyone truly immune to the effects of this itch-inducing oil? Many experts say otherwise. According to the American Academy of Dermatology, our bodies are always changing. In fact, most of the cells in our bodies are constantly dying and regenerating, making us almost entirely physically different every decade or so. Every 2 to 4 weeks, the outer layer of our skin is completely renewed, which may mean that someone who isn't affected by poison oak now may be more allergic in the future. The biology of our skin is incredibly complicated, and the relationship our bodies have with urushiol is peculiar to say the least. So I sat down to talk with the dermatologist to learn more about it.
I probably have at least one case of pretty severe poison oak almost monthly, certainly more in the spring, summer months of the year, but one is probably fair.
Dr. Ingrid Roseborough is a dermatologist with the Dermatology Center of the East Bay, located in Oakland, California. Throughout her career, she has treated many cases of poison oak. She explained to me the process of what happens after one comes into contact with the oil on poison oak, and how people can be affected in different ways.
You know, contact dermatitis is what we have when you get a reaction to something you have an allergy to. There are different types of reaction, but this is allergic contact dermatitis to a plant. And it's very, very inflammatory. So painful blisters, that's a common common way it presents. Sometimes it'll be a very funny linear, like lines of where the plant or where the oil contacted the skin. And some folks just seem to really have an aggressive response to that plant and can cause quite a devastating and inflammatory rash.
So I'm kind of curious, what exactly happens when urushiol oil comes into contact with our skin? What about it causes such a bad reaction? What does it do when it goes into our skin?
Sure. So urushiol oil is a kind of a light oil that you can find on the stems, the leaves, various parts of the plant. And what happens is if someone has contact with the oil, it sits on the skin, and then it gets easily absorbed because it's kind of a light oil that can have some penetration when it comes to contact with the skin. And then on the molecular level, that oil, that antigen that we call it, gets presented through your immune system to the lymph nodes. So these little cells carry it from the skin and present it to the lymph nodes, where all of these immunologic cells are stored in the body. And for someone who has had contact with this oil in the past, it recognizes it. These lymphocytes recognize this antigen and react to it. It's basically creating an inflammatory response to expel that contact, and that causes all of the inflammation, the blistering, the pain, the itch systemically in the body. So it's a complex metabolic process that occurs once that oil comes into contact with the skin, and then your body's basically trying to protect you from it.
Urushiol is the culprit when it comes to the poison oak rash, and it turns out that it even affects us down to the molecular level. But something I wondered about the rash was if there were different ways poison oak could be contracted. There seems to be a lot of confusion in the community about how poison oak spreads. Is oil the only way we can get poison oak? Once someone has the rash, can it be contagious? Can people pass the rash to one another through direct contact, like ringworm or chickenpox? Or are the reactions strictly through contact with the oil? Dr. Roseborough had an answer for that too.
Yeah, you have to come into contact with the oil. So if you have cleansed your skin and removed all traces of the residue, then you can't give the rash to someone else. They would have to come into contact with it themselves in order to see the rash. The other thing that happens is what we alluded to earlier, that it sets off this massive just immunologic storm. So you can have the oil that contacts one part of your body, yet a totally different, even a distant site can also become inflamed, angry, and red, even if it didn't come into contact with the oil. So both direct contact and your immune system are involved in this spreading around the body.
It's incredible that just one brush against a plant can permeate oil into our skin and elicit such an intricate biological response within us. Who would have thought nature would create such a relationship? But then again, nature doesn't always make sense. Nature just is, and is one small piece of the convoluted puzzle that is planet Earth. We have to accept that we are a part of it.
Wildfires are scorching the West Coast, leaving behind a path of death and destruction.
The Bear Fire. This is part of the North Complex, which has burned more than 250,000 acres.
Now to that explosive new wildfire in Southern California. It's being fueled by ferocious winds, including a gust of 95 miles an hour.
The U.S. West Coast isn't only known for its poison oak, but also infamous as one of the most fire-prone regions in the world. And with each year that goes by, the fires seem to be getting more frequent and intense. But how does this have anything to do with poison oak? In my research, I have found that one of the most fascinating things about poison oak is what happens when it catches fire. Each year, as thousands of acres of land burn in the West, everything in the ecosystem is affected. Countless animals are harmed or displaced, and the plant life faces incredible devastation. And among that devastation, poison oak is included in the casualties. But unlike a lot of other native plants, poison oak is coated in oil. So when poison oak burns, the urushiol doesn't just disappear. It goes airborne and turns to toxic smoke. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, if urushiol smoke is inhaled, it can cause severe allergic respiratory problems, like damage to the lining of the lungs. The government of Quebec even suggests that internal health problems caused by urushiol-laced smoke may lead to death. As if contact dermatitis wasn't bad enough. The good news, it seems that the farther the smoke travels, the less concentrated the toxicity is, meaning that one most likely won't be affected by poison oak smoke unless they are close to the burning plants. But even if most people aren't affected by poison oak smoke, there are those who are constantly in danger of exposure. As wildfires increase in the West, we depend more on firefighters to put out forest fires that get out of control. Not only is there risk with the raging flames, but also risk of exposure to poison oak, both through direct contact and through the toxic smoke. To learn more about how firefighters encounter poison oak, I met with an acting wildland firefighter. So when you're on duty, do you pretty much encounter poison oak every single time you're out?
Yeah, almost. Yeah, when we're out cutting, we say cutting project is our, kind of jargon for when we're doing our project work, and even just on our PT hikes when we're, doing because we do a lot of hiking just to stay in shape for the season. And so it's pretty much unavoidable. We work for 14 days straight on fire assignments, and we're typically camped out, sleeping on the ground. And, when it comes to personal hygiene, your options are kind of limited. So there's not a lot of chances to shower. We usually have like one change of what we call our greens and our yellows, which is the Nomex protective clothing we wear. So we can usually only change out of those once per assignment. And so, if you get exposed once, we're in that, then you're just, stewing in it for 2 weeks.
My goodness, that's rough. So yeah, if you go through it, it's just on you and you can't do much about it.
Ernesto Avila is a wildland firefighter with the National Park Service, stationed in the Groveland Ranger District of Stanislaus National Forest, an area that shares a border with Yosemite National Park, an area that is also home to a lot of poison oak and wildfires. Ernesto shared with me some of his many encounters with poison oak, but what I was most curious about was urushiol toxic smoke, and if he had ever experienced it firsthand.
Luckily for me, I have not had to deal with that. I'll say, haven't had to deal with that yet, because I'm sure it'll happen eventually. But yeah, I've heard the stories. I've heard it burns. The smoke's one thing, and then also on fire assignments, there tends to be a lot of use of wood chippers, and so that's another way that it kind of gets into the airborne. And that's something we've talked about in like tailgate safety meetings and things like that. But it is kind of hard to tell because breathing in smoke is already uncomfortable, so it's kind of you don't really know where that crossover is between just getting smoke in your eyes or vaporized poison oak.
Luckily, not all firefighters have experienced urushiol-laced smoke personally, but the danger of exposure to this phenomenon is still real, and it's imperative that we all take precautions to avoid exposure. Ernesto's final thoughts on the topic summed up one of the most challenging aspects of contracting poison oak as a wildland firefighter.
I'd say as far as how poison oak affects firefighters, for me personally, I think the waking up in the middle of the night scratching is probably the biggest thing. Like during the day when you have it, when you're working, you're kind of distracted and it doesn't really bother you, but once it starts affecting the quality of your sleep and your rest at night, especially like I was saying on those 14-day assignments where we work like 16-hour days for 14 days straight, like if you're not getting good sleep, that can really like reduce your effectiveness throughout the day and really mess you up.
Poison oak is a force to be reckoned with. It has gotten its reputation for the number of ways it can affect us. By merely touching it, coming into secondhand contact, or even breathing in its smoke. This leafy shrub can elicit responses in the human body that are anything but pleasant. But does poison oak deserve the disdain it receives? Even with all of the dangers it poses to us, maybe there is more to it. Perhaps we should consider a new perspective, and our eyes might be opened up to an entirely different world that we haven't yet considered. When we see and think about poison oak, there may be negative feelings towards it. Throughout time, it's been given nicknames like evil ivy and evil plant. But the reality is that poison oak does far more good than it does bad. You see, just like all living things, poison oak has a role in its ecosystem. And if it were to be removed completely, well, the entire ecosystem could suffer. If you take away the human perspective, poison oak can be seen in an entirely different way. Humans are among just a puny percentage of all living things that are affected by poison oak. Most animals have not been observed to be sensitive to urushiol at all. Humans and a few other primates are among the only observed species to show physical reactions after contact. Not only are other species unscathed by poison oak, but many animals consume it. Whether it's the leaves, the stems, the flowers, or even the berries, poison oak is an important food source to a plethora of creatures along the West Coast. To learn more about the positives of poison oak, I spoke with a Bay Area naturalist and one of the biggest fans of poison oak I know.
There was a time not so long ago where I didn't think beyond poison oak is kind of this leafy thing over there that you avoided, but I accepted it and everything. but then you realize it has these beautiful flowers, tiny little flowers that smell good. And bees are buzzing around and all these different animals are eating the seeds. And I don't know, there's just more to it when you look a little closer.
Anthony Fisher is a naturalist with the East Bay Regional Park District at Tolder Nature Area in Berkeley, California. As an expert on Northern California native plants and animals, Anthony naturally had a lot of great information to share about poison oak. Information that I feel shows the true beauty of our favorite itch-inducing plant.
It's great stuff. It's one of those organisms that has a lot of, it contains psychic human powers because we imbue all this onto it like a rattlesnake, It's just like this thing over there that's glowing.
So human beings are one of the only animals that are affected by the oil found on poison oak leaves. Most animals aren't affected by it. In fact, a lot of animals will eat poison oak. So I'm kind of wondering if you could tell us about some of the animals on the US West Coast that will eat poison oak.
Apparently deer enjoy the leaves, and also, we use goats for fuel reduction in the park, and they nibble on that poison oak, and it's considered okay forage for cows also. And then the birds like the seeds, and squirrels and probably rodents like rats and mice probably go after those seeds more. And a lot of the seeds persist on the plant through the winter, and so they must be a pretty valuable resource, at that time for birds. And it seems, just on my observation, more important than I realized for many years. So it seems like a lot of animals like to use it. You see wood rats building their nests around, they like some kind of structure to sort of start their home on, and poison oak they're often in the poison oak. Poison oak can be kind of dense, so it does create a nice hiding place for a lot of animals.
Before I started researching poison oak, I never even realized that it grows flowers and berries, and how vital these products are to so many West Coast species. But as with most things, we shouldn't judge a book by its cover. Take a closer look at the role that poison oak plays in the environment, and our negative relationship with the plant becomes just one paragraph of a 1,000-page novel. Not only is it a food source for animals, but also a resource for shelter. It was mentioned that pack rats use it for nests, but so do birds, like the California towhee, which builds its nests among the low branches. And western pond turtles, the only native freshwater turtles on the West Coast, have been observed using poison oak as a hide after crawling out of creeks and ponds. Not to mention the plethora of insects and arachnids that take advantage of the shrub too. Many of these animals form coactive relationships with poison oak, the animals relying on the plant for shelter and food, and the plant relying on the animals to spread its seeds so that it may continue to grow in western ecosystems. This champion of a plant is also responsible for the preservation of native landscapes. It has an incredible ability to outcompete invasive species that would otherwise mutilate habitats. Non-native species like English ivy and Himalayan blackberry were brought to the US West from other parts of the world, and thus did not co-evolve with the rest of the native species. These plants take advantage of the conditions here and often choke out the native plants. But nay, says poison oak, with the swift rate of its growth and its capability to flourish in a number of different landscapes, poison oak successfully combats invasive species all along its range, quickly growing in habitats so that the invasives don't take over. And it turns out that our healthy fear of poison oak is actually a wonderful thing for nature. We can create quite a bit of disturbance just by going through an environment, but explorers like myself would rarely dare to trek through a thicket of poison oak like this one right here. we know what the itchy outcome would be. So areas that grow poison oak tend to be a little less disturbed by people, and thus wildlife can prosper without as much encroachment from people. Poison oak is an ecological staple to the landscapes that it grows in. The balance that it brings provides services to dozens of animals and other plants. So the heinous reputation we have bestowed upon it is truly undeserved. Though poison oak may deserve more respect than it receives, the inclination to avoid it is understandable and absolutely necessary because of our biological responses. The ability to identify poison oak is an essential skill to have, so that we may both admire it from afar, but also be able to avoid contact with it. To get the best tips and tricks on where to expect poison oak to grow and how to identify it, I asked Anthony Fisher what to look for.
They grow in a bunch of places, but yeah, Oak Bay Woodlands right around us here is a good place. And of course, you know, when they're underneath and the understory, they're kind of lush, open plants. They can fill a whole, you know, creek bed. Some of them will then, of course, climb up the tree as a vine to reach the light. And then sometimes you see poison oak on an open grassy hillside, and it's growing like a little mini tree, a tough shrub standing up on its own. So it has a bunch of different growth habits. That's pretty fun. I don't know, it's kind of hard to think of a place where it doesn't grow. Just if you get too high in elevation, 5,000 feet or something. But otherwise, it's pretty happy everywhere.
So the best way to prevent getting poison oak is by, of course, learning how to identify it out in the wild. But that could be challenging because poison oak looks different depending on the time of year. So Anthony, I'm wondering if you have any tips or tricks on how to identify poison oak.
So a park visitor once said, why don't you put signs on the poison oak so people don't run into it? And I said, well, the park would just be nothing but signs, and that wouldn't look nice. Besides, it already has a sign on it. You just don't speak the language. You know, you just got to learn what the plant is trying to tell you. So yeah, we all know that leaves of three, which is a bit misleading since they are actually leaflets. It's one leaf with three leaflets, but that doesn't make such a great rhyme. So there's the leaves of three. They're often shiny. The edges are kind of scalloped, but they can vary, like you say. And then when they're first leafing out, the green chlorophyll is not present, and so they're kind of bronzy. And then at the end of the season in the fall, of course, they're breaking down the chlorophyll, and again, those red colors are showing. It's our best fall color here in the lowlands of California, if you can just get over sort of the mental, you know, resistance. Once they lose their leaves, what I look for is a sort of, you know, fawn brown, this kind of light brown stem, and it has very short side branches. So you'll see all these stems sticking up with just these little 1 and 2 inch side branches on them. That's a pretty good indicator. I would suggest to people who like to roam in the woods and maybe, you know, don't always stick to trails. If you want to have a little extra freedom in the woods, you know, really study poison oak and learn about it and see it and practice seeing it. And if you can really learn to pick it out, you know, from a distance, up close, in all its different forms, then that can give you a little extra freedom in the woods if you're at this point feeling fear. So yeah, become a friend of poison oak and gain a little freedom.
Our gorgeous western landscape is overflowing with diverse flora and fauna, and each species is important in some way. This includes our old pal poison oak. And although some of us may have had dreadful experiences with contracting the rash, it's hard to deny its significance and how truly beautiful it can be. It's not just some plant sitting there to be avoided. It is the base of many ecological relationships, an unsung hero of Western landscapes, and one of nature's best examples of how there is almost always more than what meets the eye. Become a friend of poison oak, and maybe you'll see it completely differently when you encounter it next.